Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Indeed, we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We seek His aid, we seek His assistance. Whosoever Allah Azza wa Jal guides, none can misguide. And whosoever Allah Azza wa Jal misguides, none can guide. I bear witness that none has right to be worshipped except Allah Azza wa Jal alone without any partner. And I testify that Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam is his final prophet and messenger. Well, alhamdulillah, we've gathered once again to discuss the Fiqh of Ramadhaan, and we've discussed the major chapters which pertain to the Fiqh of fasting. And the last chapter we covered, it was the matters which break the fast, mufsidat as-sawm, the matters which break the fast. The author then mentions, after this chapter, he mentions the sunnah aspects with regards to fasting. Right? There is adabul wajiba and there is adabul mustahabba. So there's etiquette which is considered to be obligatory to observe upon the fasting person, and there is etiquette which is considered to be recommended. Taib. So what is the obligatory mannerism that the sa'i must observe? They must stay away from eating and drinking and all other things which break the fast, as we have learned, as well as sexual intercourse. From the time the sun rises, or rather the time of true dawn, up until the time the sun sets. And whoever observes this is considered to be a sa'im, the person has observed fasting of that day. However, there are recommended actions which is considered to be adabul mustahabba, meaning an action which is recommended for the fasting person to observe. Because we know the greater goal behind fasting is, as Allah Azza wa Jal says, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So Allah Azza wa Jal told us in this verse, which is the often read verse, of the fact that fasting has been prescribed and made wajib upon us, as it was made wajib upon the nations before us, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So Allah Azza wa Jal tests us, who of us are best in deeds and actions. لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. And then in relation to fasting, Allah Azza wa Jal tested us, and He also told us what the goal of fasting is. And the goal of fasting is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So young people might ask, what is the wisdom behind fasting? And we'll say we have to feel how the indigent or those who are in need feel, because they don't have food and drink, so we have to also feel this. That is from amongst the many wisdoms of fasting. But the main goal of fasting is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you may imbibe within yourself the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the sa'im is the one who must be aware of his statements and his actions, the way he conducts himself. Because Ramadan is a time to better one's character. Some people say, this is the way I speak, this is my nature, and they use foul language and the likes. Even inside of Ramadan, right? Even inside of Ramadan. And the people say, you're speaking like this, you might as well eat. But we already learned what breaks the fast. So these matters, when a person acts in a vile manner and they speak in a vile manner, this causes the reward for fasting to depreciate and to diminish, up until nothing remains except the fact that the person has fulfilled the obligation of fasting. In the hadith that tells us about the recommended sunnah in terms of our akhlaq in Ramadan, the one who does not leave off qawla zur, he doesn't leave off false speech, and the person who doesn't leave off false actions, vain actions, then Allah Azza wa Jal is not in need of him to leave off his food and his drink. So the sa'i must imbibe within himself taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is by observing the recommended actions. So the first action the author mentioned, Shaykh Abdul Rahman ibn Nasir as-Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala, is he mentioned the sunnah of suhoor. Right, the sunnah of suhoor. And he said, لا يزال الناس بخير ما عجل الفطر. And then he said, وَقَالَ تَسَحَّرُوا فَإِنَّ فِي السَّحُورِ بَرَكَةً. The first two actions he mentioned was in relation to the meals that we have in Ramadan. Naam. The meals which we have in Ramadan. And the first of these meals is the suhoor. And this is the sunnah of suhoor for the fasting person. Based upon the hadith found in Bukhari, where the Prophet ﷺ said, تَسَحَّرُوا فَإِنَّ فِي السَّحُورِ بَرَكَةً. That take the suhoor, for in the suhoor there lies blessings. So what is the blessings contained in the suhoor? The blessings is in the food itself. How so? Because usually outside of Ramadan, you sustain yourself with at least 3 meals, and you have a snack in between, and your tea, and so on and so forth. But in Ramadan, you have a small meal, inshallah, in the morning, and that suffices you for the day. And it doesn't keep you full for the day, but that meal suffices you. And this is the first barakah the person attains. It is by taking the suhoor, the food which you eat. And with regards to suhoor, the fasting person must be smart. What do we mean by this? In terms of what he eats. Right? Is there any sunnah foods which is encouraged for us to eat in the morning? Dates. Right? The Prophet said, Ni'ma suhooril mu'min at-tamr. What a blessed suhoor for the believer is dates. But some people naturally, they don't like dates. Especially when you taught the sunnah to the younger learners, they say, I don't like dates. So what do you then go for? Go for food that will last you for a long time, right? Eating the leftovers, such as the fast food, Gatsby's, fish and chips, tuna. You're setting yourself up for difficulties, huh? So eat meals that is known to sustain you for longer, right? And this is personal recommendation. Oats, right? The jungle oats, avocado on toast, water, and so on and so forth. But don't eat something heavy. In fact, some people, where I grew up in my area, they actually used to have their supper for suhoor. So they would have their meal. If this is your preference, la bas, no problem. But it does make fasting difficult for the person. So the food which is sunnah for a person to have for suhoor is dates, right? It is dates. And the Prophet said, تَصَحَّرُوا فَإِنَّ فِي السَّحُورِ بَرَكَةً. Take the suhoor, for in the suhoor there is blessings. And the main blessings we attain from having the suhoor, it is the blessings of following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Because the Prophet ﷺ commanded with the suhoor, right? He commanded us to take the suhoor. Is it wajib or is it recommended? It's recommended. Because the person overslept and he never had the suhoor, is his fasting accepted? Fasting is accepted. So it is recommended to have the suhoor. And this is the barakah which we attain. It is the barakah of following and adhering to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Muslim has the intention that he's following the command of the Prophet ﷺ, based upon this hadith. That's number one. And he also has the intention that by way of this food he's eating, he seeks help to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by way of this, that meal, it even becomes a matter which is rewarding. That you get rewarded for having suhoor, based upon that intention. There's other narrations that mention that Allah Azza wa Jal and His angels, they send salutations upon those who take the suhoor. Right? The hadith says, As-suhuru akluhu baraka, fala tad'uh. The Prophet said, taking the suhoor is blessings, so do not leave it off. And then he said, Walau an yajra ahadukum jur'atan min ma. Even if one of you to take a sip of water. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ وَمَلَائِكَتَهُ يُصَلُّونَ عَلَى الْمُتَسَحِّرِينَ. For Allah Azza wa Jal and His angels, they send salutations upon those who take the suhoor. So we're sitting at the suhoor table, at the breakfast table, and you're half asleep. But you have this intention that you're following the sunnah. And in that lies blessings. And also you attain salutations from Allah Azza wa Jal and His prophets. That's amazing, right? So firstly, when it comes to salutations from Allah Azza wa Jal, the scholars have mentioned that this is Allah Azza wa Jal's mentioning of you fi mala'il a'la, because Allah Azza wa Jal cannot send salutations upon any individual. But what this salutations mean, it means that Allah mentions you by name in the greatest of assemblies, and this is in the assembly of the angels. And when salutations come from the angel, the scholars mention that this pertains to the angel seeking forgiveness for that individuals. So the angels are seeking forgiveness for you whilst you are having this meal, the meal of suhoor. So something in relation to suhoor that we must make mention of, it is, what is the ruling on imsak? What does imsak mean? To stop eating. And most of the calendars have this. They say, stop eating 15 minutes before Fajr. So what's the ruling on this? Is it something which is wajib? Is it something which is recommended? You say it's not recommended, or is it recommended?
Yeah, I said it's probably recommended, but you don't have to follow.
Aye. So, in relation to this mas'ala, some scholars have said that this is a bid'ah, that which the taqweemat, the calendars contain, of abstaining from food 15 minutes before Fajr, it's an innovation. Why? Because it wasn't known in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to delay the suhoor, and this is one sunnah of suhoor, is that the suhoor must be delayed. And some companions said that they had suhoor with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then he stood up and he prayed. And the question was asked to them, what was the length of time between the Fajr prayer and suhoor? They then said it was the length of 50 ayat. 50 ayat. So, how long does it take to read 50 ayat? Half an hour? MashaAllah. Depending on the surah, correct. But Ibn Baz has actually tried to quantify it, and he said, Rahimahullah Ta'ala, 50 ayat could be 5 minutes or 7 minutes. And some scholars even said 10 minutes, right? So 5 minutes to 7 minutes, that's what Sheikh Ibn Baz said, and other scholars said 10 minutes. So meaning the Prophet also delayed the suhoor to 10 minutes before the adhan. You with me? And he ate in that time. So there is no concept as imsak, abstaining from food beforehand. Because you're only being commanded to abstain from food when the white thread becomes manifest from the black thread. وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ. Then eat and drink up until the white thread appears manifest from the black thread at the time of pre-dawn. Right? Pre-dawn, through dawn. So you can eat up until that time. Naam, you can eat up until that time, up until the waqt is in of Fajr. And how do we establish the waqt? The radio or the adhan in our areas, correct? The adhan in our areas. So the scholars do mention that the way you establish dawn and the way you establish the sunset, it must be بِخَبَرٍ مَوْثُوق. It must be from a reliable source. Taib. So the condition that we mentioned, perhaps which relate to those who sight the moon, also pertains to those who inform us of the adhan or the time of Fajr. Right? So once that is established, then you must stop eating. And there is no such concept as imsak. And the wisdom behind imsak, as the people say, it is to be cautious of not eating at the time when it is Fajr. So it's a precaution. However, the best of precaution lies in adhering to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And the sunnah is that the Prophet ﷺ delayed it up until that space that we mentioned. Naam. The author then mentions, وَلَا يَزَالُ النَّاسُ بِخَيْرٍ مَا عَجَّلُ الْفِطْرِ. He then mentions the sunan with regards to breaking the fast. And he said that the people will not cease to be upon goodness as long as they hasten to break their fast. And that's the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is that one must hasten to break their fast. They should not delay. As soon as it is established that the sun set via the radio or your local masjid, it is sunnah for you to break your fast and not to delay. So some people yani want to get the reward of feeding a fasting person, and they pass the date around and then they have a date. It would be better for the person first to break their fast and then to get the reward of feeding a fasting person by yani passing around dates or whatever. So with regards to this mas'ala, Allah Azza wa Jal says in His book, ثُمَّ أَتِمُّ الصِّيَامَ إِلَى اللَّيْلِ. Allah then mentions in the Quran that then complete your fasting up until night time. Right? Up until night time. That's what the verse reads. And one occasion, I was asked by a Shia, if you claim to follow the Quran, then why do you break your fast when the sun sets? Because the Quran says, complete your fasting up until night time. That's what the Quran says. But we know that the Sunnah tufassirul Quran wa tubayyinu, that the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, it explains the Quran and it clarifies it. So the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, wherein the Prophet ﷺ commanded one of the companions to make adhan, and they said it's not yet night time, meaning it was still light, right? The Prophet repeated it, and he said it is not yet night time. And he said this on 3 occasions, and he says not yet night time. And then on the 4th time, the person established the adhan, and the Prophet ﷺ stood up and he broke his fast by drinking water. And then the Prophet ﷺ said the following words: إِذَا أَقْبَلَ اللَّيْلُ مِنْ هَاهُنَا وَأَدْبَرَ النَّهَارُ مِنْ هَاهُنَا وَغَرَبَتِ الشَّمْسُ فَقَدْ أَفْتَرَ الصَّائِمُ. The Prophet then said, when night appears from here, from the west, وَأَدْبَرَ النَّهَارُ مِنْ هَاهُنَا وَغَرَبَتِ الشَّمْسُ, and the sun has set, فَقَدْ أَفْتَرَ الصَّائِمُ, then the fasting person must break his fast. So this hadith, which is agreed upon its authenticity, it will clarify the verse, yani, in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where Allah Azza wa mentions, then complete your fasting up until night. What is meant by it is, yani, the sun sets. And we know that when the sun sets, a new day enters. So this is the sunnah with regards to breaking the fast, is that once the Muslim has certainty that the sun has set, he can break his fast. So we give an example. If you're at Sea Point Promenade, right, and you're having iftar there, and you see the disk of the sun, yani, setting, and it goes beyond the horizon, must you still wait for the adhan to go, or can you break your fast? You can break your fast, because that is what the hadith says. وَغَرَبَتِ الشَّمْسُ فَقَدْ أَفْتَرَ الصَّائِمُ. It then becomes sunnah for the person to break their fast. And we said the sunnah is to hasten to break the fast. The sunnah is to hasten to break the fast. The next sunnah which we can follow is, with what should we break our fast? Dates and water. Okay. So is there a level that you follow? Is something preferred over others? Dates. Firstly, dates. Right? Because the hadith of Anas says, كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يفطر على رطوبات قبل أن يصلي. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم used to break his fast with moist dates. Right? Before he used to pray. So moist dates is a sunnah to break your fast with. And they then said, فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ رُطُبَاتٍ فَتَمَرَاتٍ. And if he couldn't find moist dates, he would break his fast with tamarat, any dates. فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَمَرَاتٌ حَسَوَاتٍ مِنْ مَاءٍ. And if he did not find any dates, he would then drink some water. And he would do this before he would pray. Right? And here the scholars mention an important mas'ala. And that is, when you break the fast, the sunnah is to simply break the fast by having dates or water, and then to pray Maghrib. And of course, to pray Maghrib in Jama'ah is better, right? But sometimes you find that first, in Cape Town Mino tradition, the savories, the halim, the soup, the puba, all these things, you must first have that, and then you go pray. No, you break your fast, and then you go pray. Right, that is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, which we learn from this hadith, is that the Prophet would break his fast with some moist dates before he would pray. The author then mentioned, rahimahullah ta'ala, إِذَا أَفْتَرَ أَحَدُكُمْ فَلْيُفْتِرْ عَلَى تَمْرٍ, and that we mentioned already, is that the sunnah is to break the fast with dates. The author then said the next etiquette that the fasting person must observe, he said, قال صلى الله عليه وسلم من لم يدع قول الزور والأمل به والجهل فليس لله حاجة في أن يدع طعامه وشرابه. That the one who does not leave off obscene and vain speech and acting in a vain manner and acting ignorantly, then Allah Azza wa Jal is not in need of this person leaving off his food and his drink. So that's where the people in Cape Town say, you might as well break your fast. But that's not the reality, right? But this means, yani, that the fasting person must preserve his fast from anything which can, yani, jeopardize the reward and spoil the reward of fasting. And this is considered to be of the etiquette which is sunnah that the person must observe. Is that the person must be more mindful of the way they conduct themselves, how they speak. And this generally should be the habit of a Muslim. As the Prophet says, مَنْ كَانَ يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ فَلْيَكُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ. That whosoever believes in Allah Azza wa Jal and the year after, let him say something good or let him remain silent. And from this hadith, the scholars say that there is three levels of speech. Speech which is absolutely good. And what would be considered to be speech which is absolutely good? Mumtaz. Reciting the book of Allah. Remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Making adhkar. This is undoubtedly good speech. So the Muslim doesn't think with regards to this, he simply does it. Right? The second level of speech is speech which, yani, it's doubtful. How can it be doubtful? If you utter it, it's a possibility, yani, it can lead to something haram. Right? Like being, for example, excessive joking. Right? Excessive joking can be an example of type of speech which can lead you to haram. And we've been commanded to abstain from being excessively joking. Right? And this happens a lot when we're in the gatherings with our brothers and our friends. It becomes like entertainment. And it becomes a type of gathering wherein Allah and His Messenger is not remembered. So that is doubtful. So we abstain. And then there's a third level of speech which is considered to be haram. What would be haram speech? Such as lies, such as ghiba, backbiting, such as namima, tailbearing, etc., etc. That type of speech the Muslim abstains from. And that type of speech which the Muslim is doubtful with regards to, it is also best to abstain from that. Because sometimes people speak whatever's on their mind. Right? They say, I don't think I should say this, but they say it anyway. Not really, yani, considering whether this will harm the person. You say, you know what, I just speak my mind, man. I'm going to tell you anyway. And they tell you, right? Well, I don't think I should tell you. And they tell you, this type of speech is doubtful type of speech. And the reality, ikhwa, elders and brothers, is we are accountable for what we utter and what we say. Right? We are accountable for what we utter and what we say. How do we know this? The hadith where the Prophet also addressed Mu'adh. Right? And the Prophet also told him, be cautious with regards to your tongue. And then Mu'adh asked the question, will we be accountable for what we utter? The Prophet then said, هَلْ يَكُبُّ النَّاسِ عَلَى مَنَاحِرِهِمْ. Will the people not be dragged to the fire of Jahannam on their faces? إِلَّا حَصَائِدُ أَلْسِنَتِهِمْ. Except for what they have uttered with their tongues. So the reality is that what we utter, we are muhasab for it. We are taken to account for it. So moral of the story is, in Ramadan, the Muslim is more aware of the way he conducts himself, especially his speech. And for this reason, the Salaf, they used to sit in their homes and they would avoid gatherings. And they used to say, Nahfal siyamana. They used to say that we would like to preserve and protect our fasting. And so they would stay in their homes. And some of them, it is mentioned that they would sit in the masajid. They would say, we would sit in the masajid and we will not backbite any person. But sometimes even the masajid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes a place for backbiting. And especially amongst the elders. No disrespect, Haji Bakar. You go to the masajid and then the people are whispering to each other at the back. Right? We've experienced this. And they speak about the imam and they speak about this one and that one. Cake for him and so on and so forth. So the reality is that we must preserve our fasting from anything that can corrupt it and diminish our reward. Also, acting in a vain manner and ignorance, Allah Azza wa Jal is not in need of us to leave off our food and our drink. And this ties in with the hadith where the Prophet said, which is found in Bukhari and Muslim, As-siyamu junnatun. That fasting, it is a shield. In one narration, the Prophet said that the person uses the shield to protect themselves from the hellfire. So if we don't become more mindful about these and our actions in Ramadan, and we don't strengthen our taqwa, our fear, and our mindfulness of Allah Azza wa Jal in the month of Ramadan, then the question is asked, then when? Then when will this take place? If it doesn't take place in Ramadan. So the Prophet then said, As-siyamu junnatun, fasting is a shield. فَإِذَا كَانَ يَوْمَ صَوْمِ أَحَدِكُمْ فَلَا يَرْفُثْ وَلَا يَصْخَبْ فَإِنْ سَابَهُ أَحَدٌ أَوْ قَاتَلَهُ فَلْيَقُلْ إِنِّي امْرِؤٌ صَائِمٌ. The Prophet said, Sallallahu, so when it is a day that one of you are fasting, فَلَا يَرْفُثْ, you should not act in a vain way. وَلَا يَصْخَبْ, and if any person curses you, or they want to fight with you, and this happens in Ramadan, right? You go to the savory shops, and the people are angry because they're fasting, and then people jump in the line, and people start to argue. So the Prophet told us that if any person sabahu ahadun, if any person curses you whilst you are fasting, or he wants to fight with you, what must your response be? Idfa billati hiya ahsan, right? Reciprocate in a manner which is better, and push away evil with good. The Prophet then said, Falyakul, you must say, I am a person who is fasting. By way of this, you remind yourself that you are fasting, and you also remind this person that perhaps he is also fasting, if it is a Muslim. So the person should say, Inimru'un sa'imun, and this takes the person away from acting in an ignorant manner. Acting in an ignorant manner. The author then said, Rahimahullah Ta'ala, وَقَالَ مَنْ مَاتَ وَعَلَيْهِ صِيَامٌ صَامَ عَنْهُ وَلِيُّهُ مُتَّفَقٌ عَلَيْهِ. That whomsoever has outstanding fasts and passes on, then on his behalf, his wali must perform these fasts. Right? That's what the hadith says, which is agreed upon its authenticity. So the scholars have given 3 instances with regards to the person who dies and they have outstanding fasts. The first is أَيَسْتَمِرَّ الْمَرَضْ بِالْمَيِّتِ, that the person's illness that they have, it doesn't go away. And this is the type of illness where the person is not expected to recover, right? And this person never had the opportunity to fill in the day. So the person, for example, we ask Allah for afiyah and salama, had cancer. And then it's not expected that they recover. And then they die due to that illness. In this person's instance, there was no qada upon the person, right? Because the person was expected to get better. So in this instance, there is no fasting which is outstanding on this person's behalf. So we give an example of the mas'ala. Person misses 1 Ramadan. And then before the next Ramadan comes, the person passes away. There will be no fasting which is due upon this person due to the person dying as a result of this illness. The second instance is that it's a type of illness that the person is expected, or rather a type of illness when the person la yurja bur'uhu, the person is not expected to recover. So the person not expected to recover, what must he do? They must feed a poor person for every day because they come under those who are incapable, as we have discussed. Right? And in this instance, في حق المريض لعجزه وعدم قدرته على الصيام, that this person did not have the ability to fast, and if you don't have the ability to fast, you then give what we said is fidya. And the third instance is the person who was exempted from fasting, like an ill person, but they were expected, or they did recover, and then they delayed the qada up until they passed on, and they never made up the mistakes. So example of this mas'ala, a person for half of the month of Ramadan, he never fasted. Okay? So how much days must he make up? 15 or 14. Taib. But then the next year came and the person passed on without making up those days. What must be done in this person's instance? The hadith applies. Man mata wa alayhi siyamun sama anhu waliyuhu, that the person who passes on and they have outstanding days, this person's wali must fast on their behalf. And the scholars have mentioned that the Prophet also mentioned wali, but it actually pertains to any person that can inherit from the person. They can make up the day. And it doesn't have to be one person, it can be split amongst the family. It can be split amongst the family, and Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. The author then starts to mention, and we're just going to go through this briefly inshallah. He mentions the sunan type of fasting, because we are doing the book of fasting, we're doing Kitabu Siyam. He then mentions days when it is recommended and sunnah for us to fast. And the first of this he mentions is وَسُئِلَ عَنْ صَوْمِ يَوْمِ عَرَفَةٍ فَقَالَ يُكَفِّرُ السَّنَةَ الْمَاضِيَةَ وَالْبَاقِيَةَ. So the first hadith he brings is that the Prophet also was asked with regards to fasting the day of Arafah. And the Prophet said, Sallallahu, it expiates the sins of the previous year and the year to come. Right? And then he also mentioned أفضل الصوم صوم أخي داود كان يصوم يوما ويفطر يوما. That the best of fasting is the fasting of Nabi Dawood. He used to fast a day and he would not fast a day. So here the person who explained the text, he mentioned that there are various levels of sunnah fasting. The first is the fasting of Dawood, and this is the best type of fasting. Fasting for one day and not fasting for another day. He then says also fasting, what are other sunnah type of fasting? Fasting Mondays and Thursdays. What is the illah? The reasoning why the Prophet fasts Mondays and Thursdays? Because these are presented on this day, right? Then he mentions Sawm Ayyamul Bid, fasting the white days, which is 3 days of every month. Which days are this? Of the lunar calendar? The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. And then he mentions Sawmu Thalathati Ayyami min kulli shahr, fasting for 3 days of every month. And this can be any 3 days, based upon the hadith of Abu Dhar, where he said that Awsani Khalili, that my close, intimate companion, the Prophet ﷺ, gave me an advice to follow 3 deeds. And one of these deeds was fasting 3 days of every month, the lunar calendar. So the first hadith which the author brought was regarding the day of Ashura. Right? Why do we fast this day? The day of Ashura. And when is Ashura? In Muharram. So why do we fast this day? Because Nabi Musa was saved on this day, right? And when the Prophet came to Medina, he found that the Jews were fasting on this day. And when he inquired with regards to why they had fasted, they said that on this day Allah Azza wa Jal saved Nabi Musa from Fir'aun. And so the Prophet ultimately said, Nahnu ahakku bi Musa minkum. That we have more of a right to Musa than you. And this is likewise with regards to all of the Anbiya and Rusul. Because we truly follow their teachings. And the most basic of their teachings is Tawheed. Right? We adhere to their creed and their belief, so we have more of a right to them than any other nation. So the Prophet also then fasted this day. Right? And with regards to fasting the day of Ashura, then there are 3 ways you can fast. The best is to fast a day before and a day after. So Ashura is the 10th of Muharram. You fast the 9th, the 10th and the 11th. The next way is to fast Ashura either a day before or a day after. So the best is to fast 3 days. The next level is to fast either day before or day after, coupled with that day. And the last is to simply follow or to simply fast that day. And this is in relation to the fasting of Ashura. The Prophet also was then asked, the author mentions, وَسُئِلَ عَنْ صَوْمِ يَوْمِ الْإِثْنَيْنِ. The Prophet also was asked with regards to fasting on يوم الاثنين, which is a Monday. فَقَالَ ذَاكَ يَوْمٌ وُلِدْتُ فِيهِ وَبُئِثْتُ فِيهِ أَوْ أُنزِلَ عَلَيَّ فِيهِ. The Prophet said, on this day, it's the day I was born. The Prophet was born on a Monday, يوم الاثنين. And he also says, on this day I was made a messenger. Right? وَبُئِثْتُ فِيهِ. I was made a messenger on a Monday. And he said, أَوْ أُنزِلَ عَلَيَّ فِيهِ. And the Quran was revealed to me on a Monday. And this is the reason why the Prophet ﷺ fasted on this day. Taib. And then with regards to fasting, Thursdays and Mondays is the hadith that we said, these are presented to Allah Azza wa Jalla on this day. And the Prophet loved to be fasting whilst his deeds are presented. The hadith reads, إِنَّ أَعْمَالَ الْإِبَادِ تُؤْرَدُ يَوْمَ الْإِثْنَيْنِ وَالْخَمِيسِ. That the actions of the Muslims, of the servants of Allah Azza wa Jal, it is presented to Allah on a Monday and a Thursday. And the Prophet said, I love that my deeds are presented to Allah Azza wa Jal whilst I am fasting. So this is the wisdom behind why the Prophets also fast these days. The author then says, وَقَالَ مَنْ صَامَ رَمَضَانَ ثُمَّ أَتْبَعَهُ سِتًّا مِنْ شَوَالٍ كَانَ كَصِيَامِ الدَّهْرِ أو الدَّهْرِ. The Prophet said, and this is the next sunnah fasting that the author mentions, is that whomsoever fasts the month of Ramadan and then they follow it up with the 6 days of Ash-Shawwal, it is as if the person has fasted the entire year. So now we come to this conclusion. A deed in Islam is bi ashri amthaliya. A single deed in Islam is worth 10 rewards. So if you fast, 30 days, that equals 300. And if you follow it up with 6, it gives you 60. And that will be 360 days on the lunar calendar. So this is the sunnah which is encouraged for the person to fulfill immediately after Ramadan. Right? The scholars mention various reasons for this. But the first of these reasons is that after Ramadan, if you'd like to know whether your deed was accepted, look at yourself after Ramadan. Do you continue the deeds which you established in the month of Ramadan? Because fasting the month of Ramadan was wajib, and then the scholars say that this is almost like the rawatib. What's the rawatib? The sunnahs which pertain to salah. That you fulfill the wajib and then you do the sunnah prayers. So likewise with fasting, you fulfill the obligatory fast, now you continue those deeds. So if you want to see if our fasting was accepted, and this could be a sign of acceptance or not, then look at how eager we are to fulfill fasting the 6 days of Shawwal. And the way we can achieve this is, you can either fast immediately after Eid, because it's haram to fast on Eid, right? Or you can break up the days. But the practice of the elderly, in our experience, is the best. Is that as soon as they have Eid, right, they start their fasting of Shawwal. And they say, why? Because we still have that energy and we still have that vigor. So they go for it. And they fulfill it. And many times what happens is when we break it up, we delay it up until mid-month and it becomes difficult to fulfill and we lose out on this reward. So this is regarding the fasting of Ash-Shawwal. With regards to fasting Yani 3 days of every month. Abu Dhar said, أمرنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن نصوم من الشهر ثلاثة أيام. He said that the Prophet also commanded us to fast 3 days of every month, and this pertains to the Ayyamul Bid, the white days. Right? And then he brings the hadith where the Prophet said, أحب الصيام إلى الله صيام داود كان يصوم يوما ويفطر يوما. That the best of methods of fasting to Allah Azza wa Jal is the fasting of Nabi Dawood, for he would fast a day and he would not fast the second day. Other days which is also encouraged to fast, it is the days of Dhul Hijjah, the first 9 days of Dhul Hijjah. Because you know the hadith where the Prophet said that there are no days when righteous deeds is more beloved to Allah Azza wa Jal than these 10 days. Right? So the scholars say that from amongst the deeds which the Prophet did not mention, but from the deeds which is encouraged for us to do during Dhul Hijjah, is to fast those 9 days. Right? To fast those 9 days. The author then mentions وَنَهَا أَنْ صِيَامِ يَوْمَيْنِ يَوْمِ الْفِطْرِ وَيَوْمِ النَّحْرِ. He then mentions the days where the Prophet ﷺ prohibited us to fast. And which days are these? The 2 Eids. It is haram upon a Muslim to fast on the days of Eid. Right? Then he mentioned وَقَالَ أَيَّامُ التَّشْرِيكِ أَيَّامُ أَكْلٍ وَشُرْبٍ. Likewise, the days of Tashriq, it is also forbidden upon the Hajj to fast during these days. Why? Because the Prophet said that these days are days of eating and drinking and remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by way of the takbir. Another form of fasting which is prohibited is the Prophet said, and the author mentioned this, وَقَالَ لَا يَصُومَنَّ أَحَدُكُمْ يَوْمَ الْجُمُعَةِ إِلَّا أَن يَصُومَ يَوْمًا قَبْلَهُ أَوْ يَوْمًا بَعْدَهُ. That no person should single out fasting the day of Jumu'ah, except if he coupled it with fasting a day before or a day after. So in relation to this, the Prophet also said, لا تخص يوم الجمعة بصيام. Do not single out the day of Jumu'ah with fasting. So this is clear days on which it is prohibited to fast. A day of Jumu'ah, except if you fasted a day before or a day after. So the scholars have mentioned in relation to this, there are 3 instances of when a person can fast despite the prohibition. Firstly, if it is a person's habit to fast that day. So not specifying Jumu'ah, but for example, if it was a Yamul Bid, if it was the white days that occurred on a Friday, there's no problem in to fast it because this is the person's normal habit. Secondly, that a person fasts a day before or a day after. So the person fasted Thursday, then he can fast Friday, but not believing that it is virtuous. And the third level is that the person singles out Friday with fasting. And this is what the hadith prohibits. لا يصومن أحدكم يوم الجمعة. That no person should fast on the day of Jumu'ah. And what's the reason behind that? Because the Yawmul Jumu'ah is Eidul Usbu'. It is the Eid of the week. And it's a day of joy and happiness. Right? So, no person must single out the day of Jumu'ah. The author then said, from amongst the days also which it is prohibited to fast, it is fasting on a Saturday. Right? Fasting on a Saturday, based upon the hadith found in Ahmad, where the Prophet said, لا تسوموا يوم السبت إلا فيما افترض الله عليكم. Do not fast on a Saturday, except with regards to those days which Allah has obligated upon you. And perhaps, as Haji Abu Bakr mentioned, that the wisdom behind this is that this day is a day which is venerated by the Jews. And we have been commanded to mukhalafa of the people of the book. As the Prophet said, Man tashabba biqawmin fahuwa minhum. that whosoever resembles a people and they take towards their traditions, then he's considered to be from amongst them. So we find that our Sharia always encourages us to go against the practices of the people of the book. So Saturday is also a day which is prohibited to fast. The author then mentioned the well-known hadith. He then said, "Man sama Ramadana imanan wa ihtisaban ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbihi, wa man qama laylatal qadri imanan wa ihtisaban ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbihi." And he mentioned, وَكَانَ صلى الله عليه وسلم يَعْتَكِفُ الْأَشْهُرَ الْأَوَاخِرَ مِنْ رَمَضَانَ حَتَّى تَوَفَّهُ اللَّهُ وَاعْتَكَفَ أَزْوَاجُهُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ مُتَّفَقٌ عَلَيْهِ. The author then said the hadith, and he quoted, that whosoever fasts the month of Ramadan with belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking a reward, all of his previous sins will be forgiven. And he quoted the hadith also, that whosoever stands on the night of Qadr with sincere faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking a reward, all of his previous sins will be forgiven. And he mentioned, وَكَانَ يَعْتَكِفُ الْأَشْرَ الْأَوَاخِرِ مِنْ رَمَضَانَ حَتَّى تَوَفَّهُ اللَّهُ. That the Prophet ﷺ used to do i'tikaf during the last 10 nights of Ramadan, and this was his habit, up until Allah Azza wa Jal caused him to die. وَاعْتَكَفَ أَزْوَاجُهُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ مُتَّفَقٌ عَلَيْهِ. So this brings us, inshallah, to the conclusion of the book of fasting. And the author, he closed the book with a chapter of i'tikaf, right? With a chapter of i'tikaf. So, what is the evidence for the fact that i'tikaf is an established sunnah? Anyone know evidence that proves that i'tikaf and doing i'tikaf is an established sunnah? It's mentioned in the verses of fasting, where Allah says, وَلَا تُبَاشِرُوهُنَّ وَأَنْتُمْ عَاكِفُونَ فِي الْمَسَاجِدِ. Allah says that do not approach your women, right? Do not approach your women whilst you are in a state of i'tikaf. So this proves that i'tikaf, it is an established act of worship. Just like the hadith we read, that the Prophet ﷺ used to do i'tikaf during the last 10 nights of Ramadan. Taib. So, with regards to i'tikaf, it is sunnah for the person to do i'tikaf in a masjid wherein the 5 daily prayers is established. Some scholars say in a masjid which is considered to be a masjid which is jami', a masjid wherein the 5 daily prayers is established, as well as Jumu'ah is established. And what is the reason for this? The reason for this is since the person will have to seclude himself in the masjid, and he cannot leave for any reason, right? For any reason except valid reasons. So the person must do i'tikaf in a masjid where Jumu'ah is established, right? And the best of the masajid to perform i'tikaf in would be which masajid? The masjid of the people of the Sunnah. That's qaid, yani, that is a qaid zaid. Na'am. But the best of masajid to do i'tikaf in would be Masjid al-Haram, right? First and foremost. Why? Because a single prayer in Masjid al-Haram is worth 100,000 rewards. Thereafter, Masjid al-Nabawi, right? The Masjid of the Prophet would be the best of masajid to perform i'tikaf in. And then finally, Masjid al-Aqsa. Because praying a single prayer in Masjid al-Aqsa is worth 250 prayers in any other masjid. And some scholars have even restricted i'tikaf only to these masajid. However, this is not a valid opinion, right? That's not a valid opinion. So i'tikaf should be established in a masjid which you said is jami', meaning a masjid where the 5 daily prayers is established. And the person cannot leave the masjid except for certain reasons, right? So what would valid reasons be to leave the masjid? Hey? Even death, right? But they say if a valid reason would be like yani work. And the person put that down as a condition that he will leave the masjid, he will seclude himself in the masjid, and he will leave for work. But then he must return straight after work. Right? So the person, as we mentioned, the wisdom behind itikaf, it is luzumul masjid. Meaning that the person must be confined to the masjid. And the person must not leave the masjid except for certain reasons. Okay, valid reasons. And this is prescribed at any time. But the best of times to do itikaf, it is in Ramadan because of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So sometimes this is difficult to achieve. But sometimes we should plan our holidays, we should plan it around Ramadan. That if you actually took your leave on the last 10 days of Ramadan, that no one really wants to do, then you can fulfill that sunnah of i'tikaf. Right? And what a beautiful experience it is to fulfill the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in the month of Ramadan. So amongst the root of i'tikaf is that the person must enter the mu'takaf. The mu'takaf is the place of i'tikaf. They must enter it, yani, before the sun sets on the 20th day. The 20th day, and that night will be the 21st night. As we know, the night precedes the day in Islam. So this is from the conditions of i'tikaf, that the person must enter the place of i'tikaf before the sun sets on the 20th day, which will be the 21st night. And they say that i'tikaf, yani yubtil, it becomes batil, it becomes nullified by way of the following actions. So like the prayer has certain things which nullifies the prayer, such as laughing or speaking, there's certain actions which also nullify the i'tikaf. And the first of this is intercourse, based upon the verse. Right? So the person went out and he had intercourse with his wife, his i'tikaf would be nullified. Right? وَلَا تُبَاشِرُهُنَّ وَأَنْتُمْ آكِفُونَ فِي الْمَسَاجِدِ. To not have intimacy with him whilst you are secluded in the masjid. They also say دَوَاءِ الْبَيْءِ وَالشَّرَاءِ. Okay? Also doing buying and selling. Because the person, the trader, and he's in i'tikaf, but he's doing business on his phone. That would also nullify the i'tikaf. And then they summarize the issue of leaving the masjid. They say لا يخلو من ثلاث حالات. That there are three instances where the person would leave the masjid. They say if they leave for a reason which is considered to be a necessity. So what would that be? If there were a group of brothers in the masjid and they put money together and they said, okay, we put a kitty, someone must go out to get food and drink. That would be a valid reason, right? And there's no issues with this. This does not nullify the i'tikaf. They then say if the person leaves out for an act of obedience which is not an obligation, okay? The person leaves the masjid for an act of obedience which is not an obligation. And the examples they give is visiting a sick person, recommended, right? Not wajib. Or attending a janazah. They say the person, yani, should not do this except if he placed a condition like this. Like if he had a family member who was very ill, and he knew about that before he went into i'tikaf, and he placed a condition that I will leave for that specific reason, then it's fine. The third instance is that they leave yani for a reason which would negate i'tikaf. So what is the goal of i'tikaf? That you seclude yourself to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? To recite the Quran, to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to make dua. So if the person went out for a reason such as yani trade and business or intercourse, then this yani would nullify the i'tikaf. This would nullify the i'tikaf. And we already mentioned that the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is that he would do i'tikaf in the last 10 nights of Ramadan. The author then said, لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى ثلاثة مساجد. The author Shaykh Abdul Rahman rahimahullah said, to not saddle up your riding horses except to visit 3 masajid. And this is an important hadith which he brings. since this hadith teaches us that there's no place that we travel to for the sake of seeking a reward and blessing except to these three masajid. لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى ثلاثة مساجد. Yes, there are other places of historic significance, but we don't travel for the sake of seeking a reward to any other place besides these three masajid, which is the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, Masjid al-Haram in Makkah, and Masjid al-Aqsa. So there's no such thing as going on, and we have to go on a bit of a tangent here, like a krama tour, right? Going to visit the saints and doing this in a tour, like the people do a bus tour locally. Because the Prophet said, لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى ثلاثة مساجد. So what about if people make this an occasion where they travel to a country to visit shrines and to visit graves? The Prophet also said, do not undertake a journey, do not saddle up your riding horses except to three masajid. That there's no place that we go to seek blessings and reward from except these three masajid. Except these three masajid. And this is the last point the author Rahimahullah has mentioned in the chapter, the Kitab al-Siyam. Alhamdulillah, we've completed the reading of this book or this chapter. And perhaps inshallah in Ramadan we will do a reading of Zakatul Fitr. And this is something which relates to fasting bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to cause us to reach the month of Ramadan, and that He grants us safety up until then, and He makes us from amongst those who experience the entire Ramadan inshallah, and that He accepts us from us. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.